My name is Andrew Tatarsky, and I'm looking at my good friend and colleague, Julie Holland. And
Hello.
I'm very excited to welcome everyone to our first Optimal Living Dialogue. And I thought that, as the director and founder of the Center for Optimal Living, we've been thinking with our team and our colleagues and our community a lot about, what goes into optimal living. And Julie Holland, Dr. Julie Holland, and I have a relationship that goes back 25 years. Um, Professionally and personally, we've crossed paths in a number of different ways and have had lots and lots of conversations about what goes into optimal living, what it is, and how we can help ourselves and others achieve it. So I thought, what a wonderful way to have a first optimal living dialogue, but to invite Julie to join me in talking about all sorts of things related to optimal living. Harm reduction, connection, which is the centerpiece of her new book, which we'll be talking about. The role of psychedelics. She's introduced in this book, or wants to bring back also a consideration of the soul, and connection to oneself, connection to others, connection to the planet, connection to the cosmos, transpersonal kinds of connections. And so we'll be talking about all of those things in a freewheeling way. So Julie and I will dialogue for the first part of this 2-hour gathering, and then we'll open it up to participants to comment, to raise questions, and to join us in the dialogue. Let me begin by saying a few things about Julie. Julie is a psychiatrist and a psychopharmacologist, and we met, as I said, about 25 years ago. Over the course of those 25 years, I've marveled at Julie's output as an author, as a clinician. We've shared cases, and she has brought, a tremendous value to much of the work that I do with our shared clients. She has emerged as a leading voice in the new psychedelic research renaissance, something that we'll also be talking about today. And in her writings, she has really been, for me, in some ways, a role model, and her courage to take on cutting edge topics that were controversial and to kind of normalize them and introduce them to the broader community in a way that I think has made much of this material very accessible and very useful to people. She's also been really courageous in sharing her own personal process and some of her history that has really contributed to her passion for the work of helping others. And that's something that Julie and others, like Gabor Mate, who's another common shared colleague and friend, have done, which has inspired me in my own process to be more open about my own personal professional journey that's brought me to where I am. Julie has written 5 books. Her first book was, I believe, Ecstasy, The Complete Guide. And then she went on to write about her experience in Weekends in Bellevue, which is a fascinating memoir. Then she went on to do the pot book, and I was honored and excited to contribute a chapter on applying my work, integrative harm reduction psychotherapy, to a kind of personal self-guided process around practicing harm reduction with cannabis. Then she did a book called Moody Bitches, which was, maybe she'll talk about that as a controversial, challenging title.
Yes.
But really kind of challenge a lot of notions about women's feelings, women's emotionality, about why they feel what they feel, and why do we disparage women for holding the feelings, when in this time, certainly, we need women to bring the feelings into our politics, into our social interactions. And finally, this most recent book, I think, is incredibly timely. It is about the science of connection, good chemistry, the science of connection, from soul to psychedelics. And she really sort of suggests that a central issue that we are struggling with that is contributing to suffering on the planet is alienation, disconnection, isolation, difficulties in connecting. And she really kind of explores a whole range of ways in which we can ultimately connect more deeply with ourselves, with our relationships, the people we care about, our communities, the world, and the cosmos. I would say that's quite an ambitious undertaking.
Well, you know, you start small, right? I mean, you just start with connecting with the self, right? I mean, like you and I were joking before we started about, you know, having a few centering breaths or like, you know, noticing where your feet are. But the book does sort of start with, you know, make sure you're in your body and make sure you are connected to the present moment and that you're connected to yourself. And that's already a lot more connection than most of us do most of the days. You know, we're like off in thought or we're deep into our computers and we're not really in our bodies and we're not really connected to the present. You did a really good job talking a lot about this idea of like connecting with the self, connecting with another person. Then I had a really big blind spot around family and connecting with family and what that meant. But it turns out there was a lot of science there. You know, the subtitle is The Science of Connection, and there's a lot of oxytocin when you start talking about nursing, you know, breastfeeding and or childbirth or orgasm or skin to skin cuddling. Those are all like really high oxytocin states. So there was a lot that I could write about with the science of connection.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I learned with good chemistry is that oxytocin, which is sort of, you know, everywhere I look, I was finding oxytocin. Everywhere I was looking for connection or openness or trusting or bonding, I was seeing oxytocin. But the other amazing thing about oxytocin that we all need to remember is that it enables neuroplasticity. So it helps our brain cells to make new connections or our brains to even make new brain cells. So neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, synaptogenesis, which means like making new synapses, making new connections. This was something I got very interested in. Actually, when I was in high school, my mom went to grad school. She kind of went back to school, got another degree, reinvented herself, got a new job. It was very inspirational to me that she did this. But she came home one day from like some neuro class and she's like, you know, you're not going to believe this, but like it turns out that the brain can like fix itself and regenerate itself. And there's something called neuroplasticity. So even if you have a stroke, you could still learn to walk again. And like, I was really always interested in the brain and, you know, it always sort of stayed in the back of my mind, like this is a big deal. Neuroplasticity is a big deal. So it turns out that a lot of the drugs that people take to have changes in their behavior, like say you go away for a weekend to have, you know, participate in an ayahuasca circle because you're hoping maybe to make some changes in your relationship with drugs or alcohol or any other behavior or substance. But sometimes what happens when you take ayahuasca, the DMT actually really is enabling tremendous neuroplasticity to happen. So, but it turns out even hugging and being held or having good orgasmic sex, those things also enable neuroplasticity and they enable us to grow and change. So, you know, the very end of Moody Bitches, you know, the subtitle for Moody Bitches is the truth about the drugs you're taking, the sleep you're missing, the sex you're not having, and what's really making you crazy. And what's really making us crazy, what the end of the book was all about how this disconnection is really what's driving the pathology, and the disconnection is what's causing the pain and the isolation. I mean, not only does it make us sad if we can't be with the group, but it's really terrifying on a very like primal level, right? Because when we were cave people, if we got kicked out of the herd, you know, we were going to get picked off, or nobody was going to share the kill with us, or nobody was going to help us build our shelter. So like, if your group didn't like you and you got ejected, you could die. So I think on a really deep primal level, you know, we are all always sort of scanning for social cues to make sure that we're safe, socially safe. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons why these Zoom meetings are so exhausting, is because you're scanning, and you can't really see people's expressions, or, you know, it's you know, herky jerky, or their face gets frozen. And like, you know, our brains want to analyze in an analog way to look at social cues, but digital social cues, not great. Yes.
Can I jump in here? This is one
Please
thing.
do.
This is what I love about you. In the span of about a minute, you can
Like
touch on about 30 different,
orgasm,
like
neuroplasticity, Zoom
30 different
meetings.
major concepts and aspects of reality, and how they all fit together. And, you know, I need to kind of come down to basics. And actually
Okay.
what I wondered if we could dig into a little bit more, which is um, the disconnection, you know, as you've written about and you were just speaking to, we humans are wired to connect. You
Right.
know, we need to connect for our
Right.
survival, not just so that we don't get thrown out of the herd, but as you were just suggesting, you know, we need to connect physically. We need to connect and be close for our growth and our learning and our development, right? So why are we so disconnected? And now, you know, we're talking about before the pandemic.
Right. Right. I
But,
mean, that's what's
you know, Bruce
crazy, right?
Alexander did some really important research, which I know you're aware of, where he suggests that social dislocation is one of the major contributors to suffering of all kinds, you know, anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction. And
Yeah.
you know, when we look at the scope of addiction and problematic substance use and its negative consequences, including overdose, I think we can make a case that this is one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our time. Um,
Right.
and it's a reaction to this essential disconnect that so
Totally.
many of us feel. And I just might add that during the pandemic, this has just been exacerbated, you know,
Totally.
for
Yeah.
so many reasons. So why are we so
Well, I mean,
disconnected?
the irony is, you know, Good Chemistry was written completely before COVID. It came out in June, but it was written absolutely entirely before COVID. And when I talk about epidemics in Good Chemistry, I'm talking about the epidemic of loneliness that we were having, and the epidemic of isolation, and also the epidemic of overdoses. And the fact that those things were going up and up and up was not coincidental. So, not only does social dislocation and social isolation feel terrible and make us feel unsafe, and anxious and sad, but also opiates mimic the sense of safety. And opiates make us feel like we're being held and attended to. So it's this sort of synthetic, um, it's almost like synthetic social cues, or, you know, the synthetic hugging, you know. And certainly people will describe their opiate experience as feeling warm and held and fuzzy and close, or like someone is kissing me or someone is holding me. Like those are common ways that people can describe, you know, what they get out of opiates. So it's not a coincidence that the less we're being held and touched, and the less we feel safe and belonging and connected, the more we're using opiates
Might I
as a
also add,
society.
might I also add, just to broaden that, that we know, those of us who work with people who struggle with drugs, those of us who have struggled with drugs and have friends and loved ones who struggle with drugs, know that it's not just opiates, but that many other drugs are really used by people to help them feel more
Feel
connected
connected.
to
Right.
themselves and to others. So,
Definitely.
and it's not just opiates,
Right.
it's cocaine and amphetamine and cannabis and
Right.
benzos.
And then, well, what I talk about in Good Chemistry is that cannabis and other psychedelics can help us feel connected to ourselves, or help us feel connected to the planet. You know, if I go out in the woods or go out in nature and I've had some cannabis, I absolutely pay a lot more attention to the nature around me. I feel more a part of it. I feel more soothed by it. So, you know, cannabis allows me to sort of connect with myself in terms of my posture and how I'm holding my body. It helps me connect with nature and the natural world around me. And then there are things like psychedelics, I think, that either help us feel connected to the universe or connected to the cosmos, or we have this sense that everything is connected, that it's all connected, and it's all sort of a soup of energy or love, and that, you know, we are in the soup and we are part of the connection. And that feeling, you know, of oneness. I mean, I actually wanted to call the book One, and what was it? sorry, I forgot the subtitle, but anyway, the marketing department did not want a book called One or Oneness because they thought it would be, too tricky for the search engines. But it really is a book about oneness, about feeling as one, and whether that's on your own or with a partner or in a family or on a team or in a band. You and I both are musicians, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had this experience when like you're playing with 3 or 4 or 5 people and you're all like in the pocket and in the groove and you're looking around and like, you've all kind of gone someplace together, and that is a really unifying, and I would venture high oxytocin state. So yeah, I talk about how, I appreciate this example of endorphins and opiates and feeling safe is a very particular type of connection. But yes, many of us use drugs to help us connect with ourselves or connect with nature or connect with the cosmos. And I would say though that some of the things that we do are very disconnecting, right? And like the more time, I think a lot of us are using, social media or Netflix or Hulu or whatever, but we're on our screens, we're off in our own little world, we're deep in the laptop or on our phones. That's very disconnecting. But I think with social media and things like that, we have this sort of synthetic, it's almost connecting, right? If you're on Facebook or Twitter, it's almost as good as if you were really in the crowd, but it's not good enough. And so you get this situation where you're scrolling and scrolling because, this, I think it's a Gabor Mate quote, which is like, you can never get enough of something that almost works. You're like scratching around the itch. So that's how I think of like Twitter and Facebook and these things where, and Instagram and TikTok, you're just going, because you're not, well, first of all, there's no end, but you're not quite really getting whatever it is you thought you wanted or you came for. And you just, you kind of hope that volume will make up for quality.
This notion that disconnection is at the center of, the suffering, our suffering as individuals, but also the suffering of the planet, is really a powerful and interesting idea. That is that, we're having difficulty connecting with our loved ones, connecting with our families, but also connecting with people who differ from us politically,
right.
with countries that have different systems of government and living.
Yeah.
We might think about this disconnection or the problems of connection as a kind of explanatory concept that really addresses, suffering on multiple levels. I mean, this is something we can only speculate about, but I'm really curious about if you have thoughts about how did we get here? Like, what are some of the fundamental challenges to connection that make it so difficult to connect on these multiple levels?
Well, I think some of it is just sort of like learned behavior, that we're taught that as humans, somehow we're not part of the natural kingdom, we're not part of the animal kingdom, we're like our own little special thing, and I think certainly from my psychedelic experiences, I got very comfortable with this idea that we are all sort of interconnected and interdependent, and it's one organism, that the earth is one organism. But in terms of the division of where we are now, politically, like one of the chapters in Good Chemistry is about how we connect as a community. And, one of the sort of darker, seamy underbelly side of oxytocin is that it does foster or enable this sort of us and them thinking, like, you're on my team, you're in my tribe, Andrew, but that guy over there, he's not. It's this like us versus them. And oxytocin helps with social cohesion. And part of social cohesion is it's easier to have an us if there's a them, and if there's a scapegoat, and if you can all agree on a few things, there's a stronger social cohesion. And we know that being in that kind of tight society, whether it's a cult or whether you're at a Grateful Dead show or whether you're at a Trump rally, but you're with your people, and it's like a heady experience. And there's this very I would say that's a high oxytocin state also, and whether it's like you're at a concert and everybody loves this song, or you're at a rave and the dance floor, you get this sort of group mind. or you're at a political event and everyone's agreeing with you. So there is now, I don't want to speculate why now more than ever, but of course there's a lot of social cohesion on both sides and people are pretty dug in.
And I wonder if, and as a medical doctor, psychiatrist, brain person, what your thoughts are about this, but that these are almost two potentially opposing lines of development. That is the search for oneness, the search for union, the search for, communion. But that then there's this need to cohere with a group to protect against the other groups.
Right.
It's like these are two competing motives.
Yeah. Well, you can, there's something called vasopressin, which is a bit different from oxytocin in that it's more about defending your turf and defending your progeny. And men have more vasopressin and women have more oxytocin, and oxytocin works better in an estrogen rich environment. So it may be, in the community chapter, what I end up talking a bit about is this idea of being open versus closed. And this idea that, for whatever reason, I was brought up, or I just am the kind of person that if there's like a platter of food, I'm sort of counting how many people are here, how many pieces of chicken are here, how many, what should I take? Is there enough for everybody? But not everybody does that or thinks that way, and there are some people who want everybody to have enough. And there are other people who are like, screw you, I got mine, you go get yours, and it comes down to sort of like, socialism or a welfare state versus sort of capitalism, and you're on your own. And I talk about the physiology of these two states, and I sort of compare them to being in fight or flight versus the parasympathetic, because when you are afraid and defending and protecting, you're pretty closed down. You're not really open to learning a lot of new things. You're not open to socializing. It's like, the example I always give is like, if there's a fire in your kitchen, you don't pick up the phone to chat, you're like, where's the fire extinguisher? I have to put this fire out. And my social skills are not going to be so great while I'm doing this. The opposite side of fight or flight, when we're in parasympathetic, we're much more open to having new material presented to us, being open to integrating it, open to sharing, cooperating, collaborating, as opposed to things being very compartmentalized. And you should be independent. You should pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You shouldn't need anybody.
And actually there is a group psychology analogy to that was first really put forward by Wilfred Bion, which is that he studied groups, and he found that when groups are feeling unsafe, they break down in various ways. One of the ways that groups can become sort of cohering together as the group is what he calls a paranoid group. And that group comes together against the common enemy, right. To defend. The groups can break down also into subgroups that are all now fighting one another. So it seems like the through line here is feeling unsafe, feeling threatened, moving to fight flight. And that, we can move into fight flight as individuals or as groups. And what you're now bringing in is kind of the solution, is how we can create safety. And actually, I just want to introduce the idea of harm reduction and harm reduction philosophy practice as, for me, really a practice of setting up relationships that create safety, based on collaboration, based on kind of empathy and compassion and curiosity and respect, kind of setting up relationships with oneself and others, based on these core harm reduction principles. And I know you've also talked about harm reduction for a long time. That's been a part of
definitely. I mean, I don't know if this is a word, but I consider myself to be a harm reductionist. I don't know if it is or not. I learned, I was going to say I learned it all from you, but the truth is that when I was an undergrad, I was learning about harm reduction and supervised injection facilities and needle exchanges and things like that. This was, I was an undergrad like 83 through 87. So it was really just when AIDS was starting to like be a thing, and we didn't really know what was going on yet. you know, I wrote a paper about how we should just be distributing clean needles to anybody who needs it, and we should be giving condoms out willy-nilly. And, you know, my professor was like, these are atrocious ideas that are so impractical. And, you know, I love how a lot of the things that I really thought were true in the mid 80s have finally sort of come to pass. You know, whether it's like MDMA for therapy, or harm reduction. But you know, these are practical guidelines. This idea of whether you're in fight or flight, am I all jerky or is it just me? Am I coming through okay? Am I getting jerky?
You're a little out of sync, but I'm not sure if that's you.
Why?
Or the technology.
I don't want to be out of sync. I'm just looking to see what's causing this, but I can't.
Julie,
yes.
You your video and then like restart it, it might sync you back up. Maybe.
Shut down your video and then come back. Okay, thank you.
We'll see. No, I don't think that's any better. What a drag. All right. Well, I guess I'm just going to have to keep talking because I don't really have an alternative.
Well, what I was wondering is if you were on psychedelics, or actually if I was on psychedelics, because you suddenly seemed very altered.
Right. I'm not, though. I'm really not. This idea of paying attention to whether we are in fight or flight or whether we are in parasympathetic is really important. And my partner Jeremy and I, it's something we're really trying to notice in our communication with each other, because as soon as you start having a little bit of a louder voice and getting a little agitated, and you know, that means that you're either going to run away or you're going to attack, right? But in order to stay and have a dialogue, you can't run away or attack. You have to stay. And that's the first thing, is just staying in the room, staying in the conversation, staying in the relationship, you know, assuming it's not physically abusive. That, you know, I think we all do a lot of escaping. I know I do a lot of escaping, you know, I mean, I am not a baker. I've been watching the stupid Great British Bake Off show. It's so escapist. I know it is escapist. But, you know, fleeing sometimes is better than fighting. But in order to be a good dyad, you know, you have to be in parasympathetic, you have to be open, and you have to be staying, being present, being connected.
Yeah, there's a wonderful concept that I've learned, which is the zone of tolerance, of emotional tolerance. That is, if we can imagine that we could rate our emotional state from 1 to 10, between, let's say, 3 and 7 is a zone of affective intensity, emotional intensity, in which we can tolerate and think. And that when we get kicked over that, you know, our upper level of tolerance, we feel flooded, we feel overwhelmed, we feel like we're falling apart, and we then tend to move into impulsive action of all kinds. That may be, you know, where the fight-flight reaction gets triggered, you know, and then there's impulsive flight, there's impulsive violence, there's impulsive drug use, you know, sort of this desperate sense of needing to do anything to kind of discharge or to bring down the intensity of the feeling. So I agree, and this is something I know you talk a lot about in your book, many different ways in which we can kind of notice when we're getting to that upper level and do things, have practices to kind of bring ourselves back into that zone of tolerance, or I think that's what you might call para. Right?
Yeah, right. It is para. You know, one of the easiest ways to put yourself into that zone is just breathing through your nose. Just in and out through your nose is already more calming than involving your mouth at all. And then the super calming thing is to plug your right nostril and just breathe in and out through your left nostril. And that's what I tell my patients to do when they're having panic attacks, actually, is to just breathe in and out through your left nostril. And it's a guaranteed way to sort of slow your breathing down and try to put you into para. But the other thing is, anytime your exhale is longer than your inhale, you're more likely to be in para. So for instance, if I'm talking and talking and talking and talking. But like, it's letting out the air very slowly so I stay calm. But if I'm singing or if you chant, anything where you have these long exhales, is a way to keep you in para. But anyway, I mean, good chemistry is full of little tips for ways to get in para, stay in para, and to, most importantly, is just notice when you're starting to get riled up. And, you know, you can feel the adrenaline, or maybe you can feel the cortisol, but there's, as much as the sympathetic nervous system runs on adrenaline and cortisol, the parasympathetic runs on oxytocin. So anything you can do to increase oxytocin helps to put you into para, which is like if you can get somebody to hold you, or there's something you can do yourself called havening, where you stroke your arms from shoulder to elbow, and you can say things to yourself like, I am safe, I belong here, I am looked after, I am cared for. You know, it works. It's silly, but it really works.
Why is that not silly or hokey? You know, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and
right.
will actually like me. No, but so, I think that there's something so important about the things that we tell ourselves subliminally and intentionally. And we typically often tell ourselves things both subliminally and intentionally that can really make us feel bad.
Definitely. I spend a lot of time talking to my patients about sort of questioning their automatic beliefs, you know, and do you absolutely know that that's true? And can you imagine that the opposite is actually true? And I know these are sort of Byron Katie questions, you know, but her point is, don't believe everything you think. You know, not all of it is true, not all of it is good. And sometimes our thoughts will put us into sympathetic. So just, you know, paying attention to when that happens, it's such an important first step.
So there are so many things, so many directions we could go in. I'd love to get back to talking more about why psychedelics and how did you get to psychedelics. But you know, I sort of am interested in maybe hearing you talk a little bit more about what is it about you that at, you know, an early age in your career, or even career, you were drawn to these kind of edgy, controversial, radical ideas like harm reduction, needle exchange. That was
what's up with that?
I have to tell you, the syringe exchange didn't become legal until the late 80s.
No, right. It was like I learned about like what they were doing in Switzerland, or how they were prescribing heroin in Switzerland. I was like, this is crazy, you know, like, but I don't, you know, and there wasn't a lot of internet back then. So God knows like how I was learning these things. But, you know, one of the first things I did when I moved to New York City was I did needle exchange walkabout, which is really bringing the needles to the people who needed them out down on the Lower East Side. But I know I have to go. You want to go back?
People who don't know what that is, why is it a good thing to give needles to people who are injecting drugs? I mean, is that enabling or supporting? I don't know.
Well, all right. So, you know, the first thing you can think about is, all right, let's say you don't care about people who are using drugs. It doesn't matter to you if they live or die. And obviously I have an issue with that. But let's say even that's your stance. I would still say from a public health point of view that the more clean needles are in the community, the less HIV and hepatitis the community will have. So just from a public health point of view, you want clean needles. And then if you happen to care about people who are using drugs, because these are people who are in psychic pain and they have found some way to relieve their pain, then you want them to just have clean needles so that they're not shooting bacteria into their veins, so that they don't get bacteria stuck on their heart valves, which is a huge problem when you inject drugs. And also and you know, I know I'm like preaching to the choir, explaining it to you, but like, if I am a psychiatrist and I go down the Lower East Side with some clean needles and I'm like, hey, who needs clean needles? That is somebody's opportunity to interface with a doctor who is not going to judge them or demean them or belittle them. I'm going to I'm going to meet them where they are with what they're doing and be like, hey, I get what you're doing. There's some ways you could do this that would be even safer and even healthier for you. And I want to show you what they are. And then we would show them, you know, how to clean a needle with bleach, or we would give people bleach, or we would give out condoms willy-nilly. Anybody wanted them because that will reduce the spread of HIV and hepatitis into the community.
So now there's a link between giving somebody a clean needle and the title of your book, The Science of Connection, because I think it's important to consider that when we give somebody something that can help them stay safe and healthy and alive, not only are we giving them, a piece of information or a piece of equipment, but we're actually doing something symbolically that is so much more than that. We're saying, you matter.
You're a person,
you are
you
important.
matter, you belong.
I value you. I value your life. I believe in your future, and I will meet you on your own terms with dignity and respect.
Yeah. And I will care for you, right? I will care for you, because the thing that happens, and you and you've seen me get really upset talking to a crowd about this, but like, I've seen the way that doctors and nurses treat people who are addicted to alcohol and other drugs, and it's not always pretty. And people get really treated like shit sometimes in the ER, just in the hospital. And I'm not saying all clinicians all the time, but some clinicians, some of the time, you can kick a man when he's down. It's easy, and sometimes we feel powerless and we want to have these little power trips so we feel better about ourselves. So the unfortunate, result of these kind of needs is that people can really get sort of abused and have very traumatic experiences in the healthcare delivery system. So this is another reason to do walkabouts and deliver clean needles, is that people can actually have a positive experience with a member of the medical community, and maybe they're going to be more likely either to seek help or maybe to get into treatment, or just to feel like, oh, somebody's looking after me, somebody cares about me, that makes me feel good. Maybe I'll go do this other thing that makes me feel good that isn't shooting up.
I think now what you're talking about is you're bringing in trauma, and it's both, trauma that may contribute to why people use substances in really problematic ways or engage in other risky behaviors,
right,
but also the trauma that many people who use drugs have experienced at the hands of helpers. So
right.
that trauma based, on top of trauma.
And it's terrible.
That actually this harm reduction framework that we're beginning to talk about offers people in what we in sort of therapeutic language talk about as a corrective relational experience, a corrective emotional experience. That is something that can be an antidote to trauma, which is that we're actually going to do the opposite of impinge, of demand, of require, of judge, of reject.
Right, because all those things put somebody in sympathetic, right? Mm-hmm. That if I get defensive if you're judging me, if I feel like you're rejecting me, you're not including me, you're not caring for me, you're not embracing me, I'm going to go into sympathetic, I'm going to attack you, or I'm going to run away. But where we want to be in the therapeutic relationship is that the person is open and empowered, because that's the only time learning and neuroplasticity and behavior change are really going to happen. So, you're already kind of behind the 8 ball. When you go to seek help, when you go to the ER and you say, I need help, or I want to detox or something, it's hard to ask for help. You're saying that you can't do it alone, or you're vulnerable, you're in a subordinate position, and of course, it is so traumatizing when you finally get to that place where you're asking for help and you're being rejected, and just abused, treated badly.
Or I think often in a lot of traditional treatment, you're being offered something that you can't possibly accept. That is sort of jump this high. We're willing to treat you if you do this, that, the other thing, and the other thing.
Right.
Maybe even we demand that you give up the substance, which
before we'll treat you.
Life-saving for
you.
Or treating the symptoms of trauma before we'll actually accept you into treatment, which is an offer that most people can't accept. And
right. And it's traditional in psychiatry. If you go to a really traditional psychiatrist and you're using anything, they'll be like, look, once you stop using that thing, then I can prescribe for you. So that is saying like, good luck, get help on your own. And when you figured it all out, come back and I'll treat you. It's just it's nonsensical.
And just to riff on this a little bit more, one of the most bizarre things that has been accepted traditionally in treatment as the norm is if you are a person who uses drugs and you're in treatment because you use drugs, voluntarily or involuntarily, and you continue to use drugs while you're in treatment, we will ask you to leave treatment.
Right.
So that you're actually going to be punished for the very reason that you're in treatment.
Right, exactly.
And that's a norm that most people buy into, both in addiction treatment
Right.
traditionally and also in mental health care, because mental health professionals have been taught you got to get sober before you can get mental health care.
Yeah.
And so that setup leaves the majority of people who are using or struggling with drugs with no treatment. So
Right.
the harm reduction framework really speaks to that. And you as a psychiatrist, I think, are kind of a leader, and I think in what we might call harm reduction psychiatry. That is the complexities of being a person who may need to evaluate and prescribe medications for somebody who's using maybe illicit substances and has some knowledge about how to do that in a way that is
Yeah.
going to be least harmful, and isn't the kind of the collaborative relationship between the psychiatrist or the therapist or the helper and the patient, the bedrock. Creating safety makes it possible then to have these complex conversations about drug
Right.
interactions, about, you know, how much are you taking and when does it become problematic, and how might, you know, your illicit heroin interact with, you know, the
Your
Prozac.
prescription. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, I wish there were more data to pull from with drug interactions, because it's a really problematic area. And the more that people are asking questions about microdosing or ayahuasca, but they're on psych meds, the more complicated these answers get. But, you know, you mentioned something it made me think about MDMA assisted psychotherapy, because, you know, one of the ways that I've heard MDMA described when somebody is having the psychotherapy is like an immense sense of safety, you know, that they felt that they could talk about anything or they could explore anything, and they felt strong enough to do that. And that, you know, MDMA helps to enhance like a therapeutic alliance between the clinician and the client. And you and I know that, like, the better the therapeutic alliance, the better the outcome, basically. You know, if somebody really trusts you and they're open to you and you've got a good working relationship, that obviously will work out better than somebody who's very closed off to you and, you know, doesn't trust you. So with MDMA, because of this enhanced oxytocin, which is one of the things that MDMA does, there are very high levels of oxytocin when people take MDMA, and that sort of lends itself to this feeling of openness and feeling safe and feeling calm enough, you know, because oxytocin calms the amygdala, right? So it calms the fear response. So, you know, usually with psychotherapy, you start getting to something that's a little touchy and a little tender, and people, you know, I don't want to talk about it, or they just shut down, or they're like, oh, look at the time, you know, our appointment's over. And by the way, I can't come next week or next month, and I'll call you. And, you know, you lose people when you start getting into really tender areas, or when you start getting too close to the trauma. But with MDMA assisted psychotherapy, you can really get right down to that trauma, and it's tender, but it's not impossible to really take it out and examine it and have a dialogue about it and try to figure out, okay, so, you know, what is this terrible thing that happened? What was your response to the trauma? You know, what sort of things did you start telling yourself about the trauma or about you? You know, all these things can be explored in a where the client is very comfortable and really competent to do some serious exploration.
Yeah, so I wonder if we can kind of go into that in a bit more depth. I mean, I think most people who are thinking people today have heard something about this amazing renaissance of research with MDMA, with psilocybin, with LSD, even, and some other substances that is close to getting FDA approval, because the research is showing incredibly positive outcomes with many different, you know, syndromes, you know, problems of living. But so I don't think we want to go into that, but I think it would be neat to go into the process of how psychedelics kind of help the therapeutic process in more depth. And I think, you know, when you said, yeah, people can get all resistant in therapy, of course they can without a psychedelic. But I think good therapy can be very helpful, but it takes a long time to
Right.
establish a therapeutic alliance, to really create a deep sense of safety, to
Right.
help people cultivate the capacity to sit still and observe and open to deeper and deeper levels of themselves and their suffering.
Yeah.
And one of the ways I've thought about the value of psychedelic assisted therapy is that it can catapult therapy forward.
Right.
And, you know, that it's not that we do psychedelic assisted therapy and now we're done, but it can really catapult and deepen ongoing therapies. And and I'd love to hear you talk about how that happens in addition to enhancing a therapeutic alliance.
Yeah.
Something it does inside the person. But I'd also love to hear your thoughts about something I've been thinking about, which is those data and those outcomes that we all know and see who are in this area are going to challenge our traditional notions of how people can change and heal.
Definitely. Yeah.
That's one of the fascinating parts of this.
I've started, you know, there's a word that gets thrown around every once in a while, which is like disruption or like disruptive technologies. And to me, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, ayahuasca, ibogaine, like these are, and ketamine, these are potentially disruptive technologies for the field of psychiatry, that we finally have some catalysts that, yes, therapy takes forever. Like really good therapy takes years and years. And I, as you know, am not the most patient person. So it's really appeals to my sense of efficiency that you that the therapy can be more effective and more efficient and go deeper. And, it's a catalyst to make it go deeper and faster and be sort of better. It's supercharged the therapy. And the pharmacology of how it does that, I think, is interesting because, there are lots of different substances that can be used to catalyze psychotherapy. And, I will make it clear that right now, these are research protocols. These are not legal medicines. And within the research protocol, people are screened out if they have a history of psychosis or if they have a family history of psychosis. If some people are on medicines, they have to come off the medicines. There's a lot of things that have to happen. And then there's all these preparatory sessions before the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session. And then there's a lot of integration sessions after. So this is not done willy-nilly. It's still a long process. But you're talking about maybe, 3, 4, or 5 months of 2 or 3 sessions. And by the end of this whole protocol, people aren't necessarily meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Like they are significantly better. And MDMA is also being looked at for helping with anxiety, social anxiety in autistic spectrum disorders, looking at body image issues in anorexia nervosa. Ben Sessa is doing work with people who have problematic relationships with alcohol. We're going to be seeing more sort of indications, more patients who are being treated with MDMA. And for psilocybin, they're looking at end-of-life anxiety primarily, but also smoking cessation, cocaine use cessation, so and alcohol cessation for people with alcoholism. So again, we're looking at these catalysts of behavioral change, people who are ready to make changes, who want to make changes. And then because they are doing this deep sort of soul exploration, and because these are tremendous states of neuroplasticity, that real behavioral change can come out of these sessions. So these are breakthrough therapies. This is like a disruptive technology. It's very exciting. We need new tools. We desperately need new tools in psychiatry and in psychotherapy. And I'd say we've got a bunch of them. Now the question is, can we get them to people? Can we have equitable access, which is a whole other can of worms.
So I think I'd like to say, just to clarify, Julie, you are talking about research studies that many of them are in phase 3. That's the final phase before the FDA. There's enough data to support the efficacy of medications for the FDA to approve them. So none of these therapies in the United States are approved therapies. So I think it's important for folks that are listening who don't know to hear that, we are not recommending that people run out and get, psychedelic assisted therapy. It's not available in the United States. There is a lot of work being done where it is available out of the United States. There are underground circles where work is being done, and we are not in a position to recommend or judge, the efficacy of those treatments or those ceremonial circles. That's kind of outside the purview of licensed professionals. We do, I think, want to honor that there is a very long tradition of indigenous traditional use of these sacred medicines.
Yes.
That we might say is, hundreds, if not millennia, years of evidence that these medicines are efficacious. But from a American kind of medical or psychological standpoint, we still need more proof to make these substances available. But I think it was you were more courageous or out there before me with your book on MDMA. I think back in 2010, so you were
2001. You know what?
2001. Okay.
The ecstasy book, funny little story about the ecstasy book. We started a whole PR campaign and we sent out faxes, because that tells you what year it was. Mm-hmm. We sent out like hundreds of faxes. Monday night, September 10th, 2001. So Tuesday morning, September 11th, 2001. I don't think anyone really saw their faxes or responded to, I was sort of, it's a terrible joke, but I did make this joke with Jeremy at the time that 9/11 was starting to unfold. I looked at him and I said, I was hoping for a slow news week, actually, this week, because I just had a book come out. But yeah, I was a little bit early on the MDMA bagwood. As soon as I experienced MDMA for myself in 1985, shortly before it was made illegal. And I became convinced that this was absolutely, the first real intuition I had was, oh, this could be really helpful for people with schizophrenia. Oh. Because my head felt very quiet. And I thought, oh, if somebody's hearing voices or having a lot of interior monologue and, that voice could quiet down, wouldn't that be nice for them to have like sort of a respite from their hallucinations? So, and that is some research that I still would very much like to be involved with down the line. But the first order of business are these phase 3 studies with post-traumatic stress disorder, where the data is really strong.
I'd like to say that I also was introduced to MDMA in 1985 personally before it was scheduled. And so had a very early, very personally meaningful set of experiences that were related to kind of beginning to really process some of my own early trauma. So that was an early imprint for me.
Yeah.
And so I've been for many, many years kind of a quiet supporter and observer on the fringe. And I think because my work in harm reduction since 1994 explicitly, I felt at that time was so controversial, and that to kind of come out in support of psychedelics would have potentially thrown a monkey wrench into the work. But I think about 5 years ago, with the accumulation of evidence from these research studies, I finally came to feel brave enough, or that, the evidence really is strong enough that ethical professionals and ethical people should come out in support of getting this research done to really see if, these medicines can get widely out there to help many, many people.
Yeah.
But, I know that both of us have trauma in our histories that you talked about in this book. I only began to talk about personally about 4 years ago in an interview about my own personal trauma history. But you sort of
are you comfortable? Are you comfortable, Andrew, talking about anything about your own trauma history?
Sure. I'm getting more and more comfortable every time I talk about it. It kind of processes the trauma.
Right. Well, you should try doing this while you process. You'll feel even better.
But you talked about being a teenager and having some very difficult experiences that I think you point to as one of the core motivations for doing the work that you do.
Yeah, it's funny because I was sort of plotting out, I was thinking about writing another memoir, and I started plotting out all these really great stories and crazy things that happened to me in my life. But I saw that there was a pretty clear, I from a very young age, I was extremely interested in like, what does this do? What does that do? I was like doing little experiments, writing things down, like drink a beer. What does that feel? Have a cigarette. What does that feel like? you know, smoke this joint. What does that feel like? Like, you know, even the first time I took MDMA, I was like taking notes of like, you know, what time I took it and how many milligrams, like, you know, there's just like a research component in me no matter what. But anyway, when I sort of plotted the trajectory of what happened in my life, I realized that this sort of social ostracism thing that happened to me when I was in 8th grade, which was very painful at the time. You know, I was in the in crowd and then I wasn't in the in crowd, and it was just a nightmare, and it was very public, and they were calling me names in the hallway, and thank God we didn't have the internet, or I would have been like bullied online or something. But you know, after getting expelled from the in crowd and having this horrible social experience, my next school year, I kind of hung out with the druggies. You know, I hung out with the drug using people, and like that was a crowd that I had no trouble getting into. I definitely belonged there. And, you know, I felt like I just couldn't be in the in crowd anymore. You know, it was just too, I mean, some of those kids went from 8th grade onto the high school where I was, so it just really wasn't an option. So, and freshman year of high school, I tried a lot of drugs. I did a lot of experimenting, and I had a really fun, great group of friends to do it. But also, you know, I was very smart. I did really well in school. And so, you know, I was able to sort of, over time, expand my friend group. And, you know, I started being friends with all smart kids, and I played trumpet and I sang. So I was in the band and the chorus, stuff like that. It all worked out okay for me. But eighth grade was really, really hard for me. But it got me now understanding how ostracism really is like a life or death experience, and that it's a very primal need to make sure that you that, you know, the group likes you and you're going to stay in the group. And you know, I mean, 8th grade is sort of like a shorthand now. Like if Jeremy and I are in a group situation and, you know, he'll be like, oh, you got an 8th grade thing going on, you know, like it's great to have this sort of shorthand for trauma, because it just makes it so much easier to contain, you know.
So isn't it quite wonderful that, you know, your own experience of being socially dislocated, of being isolated and rejected from the group, actually, well, and discovering a group that was using drugs was a group that you could connect with. And yes. I don't know, but I wonder if the drugs actually helped this group of people who maybe like you had suffered different kinds of very difficult experiences, that the drugs kind of helped with the connection and the bonding.
It's possible.
That then now, how many years later, you know, you've become very interested in the science of connection, and how we can help people, you know, overcome those experiences like what you experienced, to connect, you know, on these levels.
You know, it's funny because I'm thinking about drug users connecting, and I remember, you know, when COVID came around, and I wrote a couple of pieces and did some interviews where I talked about like, look, I get that we all love to share joints and share vapes and share bongs, you know, but we can't right now, you know, and like everybody, you just have to like, this is harm reduction, right? You know, you need to get a one hitter or something, because, you know, this is potentially really life-threatening for us to do that. But it sort of reminded me about how, and I had this too when I was a cigarette smoker too. Like if you're a cigarette smoker, you know, you go outside some building and there's some other cigarette smoker because they have to be outside too, and you smoke and you talk about whatever. But like, you know, you already have that thing in common, and you can chat. You know, and it was sort of like that with the drug using people. Like, you know, we all had this thing in common that we like to, you know, drink beer or smoke cigarettes or smoke pot. So we'd hang out, and that's what we would do. So, you know, I still sort of feel that kind of camaraderie, I guess, you know, with my patients that I'm trying to help, or with the patients at Bellevue. I mean, you know, I lasted at Bellevue a good long time, and there were two reasons for that. One was that I only worked Saturday night and Sunday night at the Psych ER, and I had all week off to recover and, you know, forget. I mean, it was like childbirth, you know, you forget the pain, you're willing to do it again. And by Saturday, you know, afternoon, I was ready to, you know, put my scrubs on and go back to work. But the other thing that kept me going was that I really liked the patients that I was dealing with, you know, and I was perfectly happy to talk to people who were having problematic relationships with alcohol and other drugs, or you know, who were really in a bad place. And like, you know, I could sort of turn the empathy on and off as much as, you know, need be to connect with somebody and get some information to figure out how to help them. But then I had to kind of turn it off because, you know, if I would just bleed out if I like empathically connected with everybody at Bellevue on every shift, you know, it was a lot I had to turn the EQ down a little bit so that I didn't
Right.
get, I couldn't feel everybody's pain so much. But the other thing that was great about Bellevue is that if somebody came in who was very altered, and not always from psychedelics, people can get very altered from their own chemistry. And I would see pretty extreme cases of this at Bellevue where people were, in a manic episode or in a psychotic episode of some sort, but they sometimes really reminded me of my tripping friends from high school, with the same sort of like wide-eyed wonder and sometimes even dilated pupils. They looked like they're tripping. They would talk about really interesting, that thing you think is the sun up in the sky, like I think it's the eyepiece of the microscope, and I'd be like, that's cool. So it just reminded me of, these sort of high school conversations I would have with people who are tripping, for instance. But me having those experiences really made me a better doctor because I knew what it was like to feel paranoid. I knew what it was like to feel like things are all like it's all a secret language I need to interpret. And I knew what it was like to think that everything is connected and everything makes sense and like what that sort of epiphany feels like. So I think that I just had a little edge, on sort of validating people's experiences or empathizing with people because like, oh, I've been there, brother. I know what you're talking about. And I loved it. I loved that job. I will never have a job as much as I loved that Bellevue job. Even working alongside you down the hall in our little office on 11th Street, as good as it was not quite as fabulous as my Bellevue time was.
Right. You're referring to a suite of offices that I had at 31 West 11th Street.
Yes.
Between 5th and 6th Avenue with a bunch of colleagues, and you had an office down the hall.
That was my very first office.
And we bumped into each other and realized lots of common interests.
Definitely.
So you shared your trauma. I'll talk a little bit about mine.
All right. I would like that.
So, there are sort of two parts to my story about how I came to harm reduction. The first part was what I believed initially. I had seen a number of people struggling with drugs through my clinical training, in my internship, just by coincidence. And I sort of came to feel that this was a kind of undertreated, poorly treated, mistreated group of people. And when I finished my clinical training, I saw this tiny little ad for a job as a counselor in a drug treatment program up in East Harlem. And I was drawn to it, and I only really later came to understand more fully why. But I went for the job interview, they hired me, and I began my career in traditional drug treatment. And I worked for the first 8 years of my career in abstinence-only disease model treatment. And I ran an intensive outpatient program. I mean, we were in the 80s sort of trying to do something progressive and integrative and cutting edge, but we were really hamstrung by this disease model, abstinence-only approach to addiction.
Yeah.
And over the course of those 8 years, I began to see that actually we weren't helping most of the people that were coming to our programs. And in fact, I found myself having to do things, like I alluded to before, that ultimately were traumatic for the patients, and I think traumatic for me.
And for you.
I had to kick people out of treatment because they kept coming back with positive urine toxins for cocaine.
Right.
And while as a clinician or a human being, it made no sense, that was the ethos.
That's the rule.
That's the rule.
That's how we do it.
So an accumulation of those experiences ultimately led me to become more and more disgusted and confused and conflicted. And in the late 80s, I opened a small private practice, probably that one on 11, in that office suite on 11th Street. And I figured the traditional approach isn't helping most people. Let me break the rules and work with active drug users. People were referring people that were actively using. So I figured I'd accept them and see what happened. And lo and behold, many of them did incredibly well. They engaged in therapy. They cut back their substance use. Some stopped. They worked on other issues. So now I was in this total kind of philosophical, professional quandary. In 1994, I had a relationship with Alan Marlatt, who was an addiction psychologist, pioneer researcher, one of the people that brought harm reduction to the United States from Europe. I told him my quandary one afternoon, and he said, Andrew, you're doing harm reduction. So for me, the introduction to the harm reduction model was like, you know, my paradigm shifting moment. I sort of saw there's a whole new way that we could think about setting up helping relationships. And that kind of set me on my journey of developing integrative harm reduction psychotherapy. But about 10 years into that journey, in my own personal therapy, I stumbled on an experience I had when I was 15 years old in a drug treatment program. I was in a non-residential therapeutic community, and I was in it because I had been smoking pot and taking psychedelics, and I had a series of terrible, terrible trips. You know, they say that there's no such thing as a bad trip, only difficult ones.
Right.
I had some bad trips. And I agreed to go into this program because I thought this, after a series of them, it probably would be a good idea for me to get away from this. And initially, this therapeutic community was a wonderful, kind of caring, loving place that gave me structure and like a family. And then I broke a rule about 9 months into it. And if you know anything about, you know, humiliating, attacking, breaking down.
Well, that's the therapeutic community, right? That's what they do.
In 1970, I got the brunt of this. I had to wear a sign. I lost my privileges. I was shunned. I was put in the middle of rooms and yelled at. And I mean, the most disgusting, you know, and I was shell-shocked. I mean, and I began to sort of gather myself and find my voice and you know, try to express myself. And they upped the ante. They brought more people in to pound me down. So at 10 months, I said, fuck you, you know, I don't have to be here, I'm out of here. So I split. But when you're a splittee from a program like that, you're persona non grata.
Right.
So I lost my
start all over. You have no support.
Had nothing.
Yeah.
I had started a new high school, actually the High School of Music and Art, and I couldn't concentrate for the first time in my life. I'd been a good student. I wound up dropping out of high school. And there, you know, I kind of like left the thing behind, just completely dissociated the experience. But then I began to have panic attacks, particularly when I was in front of a group.
Surprise.
But what I later came to understand is that that trauma actually brought me into the drug treatment world.
Totally.
It sensitized me to what was wrong with it. That is basically what had happened to me. And it kind of inspired my passion to create this harm reduction, compassionate, respectful alternative.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's sort of a story kind of like yours about how we can turn trauma into kind of constructive, creative action for change.
You know, Jeremy has this great way of looking at it as like, you know, the things that scar you when you're younger, those are your strongest spots now, you know, and that is where you can actually do your work. So like, you know, the places where we got hurt can end up being, you know, the places where we can help the most people. Because you have that compassion.
Yeah, but what's also fascinating to me is that it was psychedelics that got me into that drug treatment program. If I had had a good psychedelic integration therapist,
you
would have helped me recognize that the quote bad trips were experiences that put me into earlier trauma, that I was in no way in a state or in a place where I could contain it and process it.
You didn't know. I mean, you know, it wasn't sort of common knowledge back then. I feel like that if you trip, traumatic things might come up that you need to process. You know, there was a lot of psychedelics around 60s, 70s, 80s. You know, we were sort of swimming in it. And I don't remember anybody sort of warning me, you know, you may remember terrible things that happened to you when you were 3 years old if you take this. So it'd
then
be nice.
The full circle is that being reintroduced to psychedelics in 1985 in this circle that was doing MDMA in a kind of an intentional way actually began a deeper kind of process of kind of addressing and healing these traumas. So
it's funny that 85 was sort of the year for both of us. Like we got in under the wire. It's like before it was made illegal. Full disclosure though, I actually took MDMA a few times after it had been made illegal.
So You
Yeah.
are another way in which you are a courageous one is that, and I need to call out our good friend Carl Hart, who's also just written a book in which he's coming out as a drug user.
Yes.
But in this
Right.
conversation, and I think in many of your conversations and in your books, you're out as a current drug user, not just a former drug user.
A bit, yeah.
That's a daring position to
Well,
take as a professional.
so it
I'd like
started.
to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think, you know, when I edited the MDMA book, I didn't really write about my own experiences, I don't think. It's funny, I don't remember. But when I wrote Weekends at Bellevue, that was when I outed myself as a pot smoker. I mean, the night I met Jeremy was at a party. It was a party for Terrence McKenna. We were smoking some of the strongest pot I've still ever had in my life, because that was Terrence. But I talked about, you know, sharing a joint with Terrence and then, you know, chatting this guy at the party and meeting Jeremy. So I sort of outed myself as a pot smoker, I think, in Weekends at Bellevue. But I don't know what I did in Moody Bitches, and I might not have done anything, but in Good Chemistry, you know, I would use phraseology like, you know, those of us who have experienced a mystical experience, or, you know, I would use the we or the third person plural a lot to sort of include other people. You know, I've had these experiences, maybe you have too. And, you know, one of the things that I sort of speak about, or, you know, if I get invited to speak somewhere, I will often bring up this idea of outing ourselves. And, you know, and it's a lot like Harvey Milk with gay rights. You know, Harvey Milk said, if you want gay rights, you have to stand up and say, I'm gay and I want my rights. You know, and I think it's the same thing, you know, with drug users. Those of us who can out ourselves, who can say, you know, I've had positive experiences from psychedelics. They have helped me grow and change. They have helped me abandon unhealthy behaviors and you know, help me end problematic relationship with substances and things like that. Like anybody, I think, who has had experiences with psychedelics, who is in a position to admit it or tell other people about it, that would help us. I mean, it's the same thing with, like, you know, cannabis users. Like the more it is normalized and destigmatized, the less of a big deal it is, and the less any of us have to go to prison for it. So
yeah, I'm glad you said those of us who can, because I think, you know, what you're
not
saying,
all of us can.
there are certainly many people who, for a whole variety of reasons, their jobs, their families, out of respect, and I want to make a comment about that we were talking about before. I haven't outed myself as a drug user or as a non-drug user. I actually take a position personally, professionally, that it would be a kind of disservice to my clients, to my patients, to my colleagues, to come out in one way or the other. If I were to say to my patients that I'm sober in AA for 25 years, I think for some people that would be inspiring and that would be great role modeling. For others, it would be intimidating, and it would bring up such frightening presumptions about me judging them if they're not going to get sober. Or on the contrary, if I were to say, you know, I'm a casual drug user, I sometimes smoke crack and sometimes inject speed, but I've got it under control. I mean, that, you know, how is that going to be helpful on either end to some people? But having said that, I think I want to make a more radical statement, which is that I actually think we're all drug users, and that, you know, and that's where I come out as a proud drug user. We're all drug users, you know, that we've got this really, really sick, dangerous, destructive distinction between the good drugs, you know, that basically that are, you know, white male patriarchy has determined, you know, we can sell. And then the bad drugs that we are identifying with, you know, marginalized communities or people of color, or that we criminalize as a pretext for arresting people and, you know, destroying communities, is just a travesty. And that we need to come out as drug users across the board. You know, why are certain legal drugs any more harmful or less harmful than certain illegal drugs? So, and I told you before, the Urban Survivors Union, which is a union of proud drug users, former and current people that are out as drug users, had made this wonderful T-shirt that says, you know, what kind of drug user are you? And then there's a picture of a syringe, of a crack pipe, of an alcohol bottle, a coffee cup, and a Pac-Man, you know, Miss Pac-Man.
Right.
And then it says, I'm a proud drug user. And I took a photo of myself with that shirt and I shared it on social media. And I got more likes than any other post ever in history.
Well, it's great.
So
I mean, it's
people
very
resonate
validating.
with that. You know, it's time for us
Yeah.
to return these demonizing, stigmatizing, criminalizing narratives, you know, pathologizing narratives about people who use drugs, because, well, it's just, it should be criminal and genocidal.
You know, one of the things I think that's happening now with COVID and the pandemic and the isolation is that a lot of us are noticing that we feel pretty terrible and we need soothing. And, you know, if we're alone, if you're living alone, you can't ask somebody to hold you, to, you know, make you feel better. And like, we have to soothe ourselves on our own. And like, a lot of us will soothe ourselves orally. I mean, that's just how, you know, babies, they're given like a pacifier or a bottle, or if they're lucky, they get a nipple and a breast and they're being held. But like, it's still that this, you know, oral soothing is a very basic way. So, you know, like the COVID-19, you know, there's people who've like gained 20 pounds in the last 6 months. There's a lot of us out there. Or, you know, the quarantini is taking on a life of its own, or these sort of things. Like right now, we are seeing an uptick in people feeling agitated, feeling traumatized, scared, you know, what's going to happen to the country. I mean, as much as maybe you're worried about fear of contagion, I would say that more of my patients are really worried about like the downfall of our democracy. You know, like there's a lot of things to be afraid of. There's a lot of self-soothing going on. And I just think it's important for us to, you know, have some sympathy for the way each of us are choosing to soothe ourselves. I mean, I really go off quite a bit in Good Chemistry about process addictions, behavioral addictions, that we really are addicted to our phones. Yeah. That many of us cannot go more than a few minutes without just checking, see if I have a text, see if I have an email, see what's on Twitter, you know, that that is a form of addiction. And, you know, maybe it's socially acceptable, but I still think that, you know, it's like a digital addiction or something synthetic. Yeah. Like, I think we should still be aware when we're doing it. You know, a lot of us make choices every day about drugs that we just don't think about. Like in the morning, I get up and I'm like, should I have a coffee or a tea or a decaf coffee or a decaf tea? And I know how much caffeine sort of is in each of them. What do I have to do today? You know, oh, I need coffee. I'll have a decaf tea and see, you know, maybe I won't get one of those horrible caffeine withdrawal headaches at 3 o'clock. I mean, that is about taking a drug, choosing to take a drug, staving off a possible like physiological withdrawal. You know, from if you have a coffee every single morning and then you don't have one, you're going to get a terrible headache at 3 in the afternoon. And that is because you are physiologically, you know, addicted or adapted to this stimulant. So yes, coffee is readily available and it's cheap and everyone's allowed to drink all the coffee and tea they want. So it's not so much of an issue.
I'd like to make one more, I think, radical statement or suggestion that maybe we can think about together. And then I'd like to kind of include our participants.
Love to do Q&A.
Some great comments. Yes. But, you know, I think that one of the things that I've really come to believe strongly is that this change in practice from punitive to harm reduction, from punitive to collaborative and respectful, is really being supported by a change in the way that we think about drug use and about addiction. And one of the ideas that I've come to more recently is that what we call addiction, which is an experience of craving, of loss of control, of obsession, of doing something desperately when another part of us doesn't want to, which is more of an experience of a dilemma, is actually on a continuum with universal human experience.
Right.
So that even this concept that there are the addicted ones and the rest of us needs to be, what was that word that you used? Disrupted.
Disentangled, disrupted.
Disentangled. You know, it's a way of maybe distancing ourselves from those parts of us that are expressed in more extreme ways by some members of the society, and probably members that are suffering more than us, and they're more desperate. So I think that I've been thinking about this as the need to kind of rehumanize the way that we think about addiction. So maybe you have a comment about that.
Well, I mean, it just makes me,
Yeah.
it just kind of reminds me of Gabor Mate again, and the thing he says where he says, like, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain, you know, that we all have pain. We all respond to this pain in a different way. We all try to soothe ourselves in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
It's, you know, how we soothe ourselves isn't really as important as why do you need soothing? What's going on, you know? Yeah, I would love to do Q&A if there's any good questions out there.
Well, so we'd love to hear questions. Let's see, there's one by Michelle Wiener. How about the connection between exercise and parasympathetic, or perhaps flow, or enjoying the exercise you do when you're exercising?
Well, I have a lot to say about exercise and flow. I will definitely try to keep it brief. The first thing I will say is that I talk about flow and exercise in Good Chemistry for sure. And, you know, most exercises I think will put you in flow, and most exercise absolutely enables neuroplasticity. So it helps with these, you know, new brain cells, new connections, new circuits, new behavior, right? So even something as simple as just doing regular cardio can help to make you more neuroplastic, more sort of flexible, less cognitively rigid. This issue of flow is sort of a secondary thing. And what flow is that you lose yourself in the doing of something, right? So you can be in flow when you're exercising or when you're meditating, or, you know, sometimes if I'm like cooking and chopping and in the kitchen, like I sort of forget myself. I get so absorbed in what I'm doing, I stop really thinking about other things. So that state of flow is definitely a parasympathetic state. And like awe, right? Awe, when you are in awe of something bigger than you, and you feel small because you're next to something that's big, that is also similar to a flow state where it's a very opened state. So yes, you're in parasympathetic, but more than that, you are primed for learning. You are open and primed to receiving new information. So when you are in parasympathetic, when you are in flow, when you are in awe, especially, it's like an optimally open state where you're really primed for learning. Oh, but my patients who are kind of anxious and agitated and freaked out about the world, sometimes I really recommend that they do things like yoga instead of running. You know, it's like if you're running, if you're sort of psychically running on empty and you're adrenalized and you're in fight or flight already, then maybe it's better if the exercise you do isn't so, you know, it doesn't sort of simulate you being chased by a tiger.
So we'd like to welcome everyone in the group. And if you'd like to turn on your videos, we'd love to see your faces. And I have to say that I'm already seeing the faces of some very special people in our lives. So welcome to the conversation. We'd love to hear comments, questions. And, you know, if you have a brief question or a very important question, but try to keep it brief for time's sake, we'd love to turn on your mic and hear from you. Does anyone?
You know what? I would like to answer Charlie's question.
Charlie Whittinger, who just came out with his own book.
Charlie's got a new book on MDMA called Listening to Ecstasy, which I'm very excited. It's coming out on Election Day, which is so crazy, but I love it. But Charlie, you know, Charlie's point is like, what should we tell our patients when they have a lot of anxiety about national events? You know, what if our world really is coming apart? And I think it's really important that, you know, I do spend a lot of time normalizing my patients' symptoms right now when they are feeling isolated and anxious, or when they're sort of despairing, you know, like we're poisoning the planet, you know, we're killing ourselves. I do normalize it, and I say, like, yes, all these things are true. It is terrible. Like, it would be normal to be depressed. It would be normal to feel anxious about what's happening. I don't want to pathologize normal human emotion. There are things that we're going through now that are very traumatizing. You know, Trump is a traumatizer. I mean, he is a traumatized person who has not fully worked through his issues and is really inflicting a lot of trauma on a good amount of the nation, I feel like. And so, you know, I feel like my patients feel traumatized because they are being traumatized. They're really scared. you know, there is a level of sort of terror and fear for their safety, or fear for what's going on, and or how divided we are, or maybe, you know, people are like, they're afraid of Antifa, or they're afraid of, you know, white supremacists. Like, there's a lot of fear, and, you know, that's going to make you anxious. And also all this social isolation because of COVID really does sort of prime you for anxiety and depression. You know, the more connected we are and the more safe we feel, the less anxious and depressed we are. So right now we're disconnected and we feel unsafe.
I think it would be great to kind of underscore what you just said and kind of put some words to it. That is, when you say to your patient, yes, it makes sense that you are freaked out. Yes, you know, I understand, you know, and maybe even I feel the same way. You know, what you're doing obviously is expressing empathy.
Yeah.
And empathy actually does what, you know, your book is talking about. Empathy connects. And
Yeah.
that connection, that empathic connection we do in psychotherapy is what helps people develop their own capacities to connect with themselves,
For
to manage,
self-compassion.
right, but also
Yeah.
self-soothing, self-comforting. But we can also broaden that, I think, that it's not just what happens in the therapeutic relationship. We can bring all of these things we're talking about into family relationships and friend relationships and relationships with people on the street and relationships with people that we disagree with, right? This kind of empathic openness to who they are and what they have to say, and to really try to listen and hear, so that we can all be kind of connected through our differences and connected in empathy.
Can I say
Charlie,
something?
you're raising your hand.
Yeah.
Would you like
Can
to?
you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, let me share something with you, because I recently had a client session where he was expressing all this incredible anxiety, and I was saying all these things to him, and normalizing his anxiety, his depression, his alarm, his being freaked out. But the one thing that really touched him was when I emphasized the need to be connected to the people in our lives at this time. And he said, "Oh my God, you're right. I'm here out in the suburbs out in the suburbs. We don't have friends who think our way, and we're kind of isolated here. And I didn't realize until this moment that how much that's impacting me." Because this anxiety thrives in the dark, and in isolation. This anxiety thrives when we're cut off from people, and then we can catastrophize and drive ourselves crazy.
Yeah,
You know, what the other thing I think worth mentioning that I say to my patients a lot is, like, you are not alone. Everybody, you know, I'm talking to 10 patients today. 10 of them feel the way you do. Like, yeah, you know, other people are anxious. I do think that misery loves company. I do think it is okay to kind of normalize it and to say, you know, this is not, you're not having an abnormal reaction to what's happening. You're having a perfectly normal reaction. What's happening is abnormal. Your reaction is normal. You know, Derek Rosenfeld said that he heard me say this, like, if you're not traumatized, you're not paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, we're living in a very traumatizing times. And so I think it's okay to normalize, like, I'm not going to just keep increasing my patients' benzos and antidepressants because they're sad and upset about what's happening. You know, I don't think that that's the answer. I mean, it's, you know, I wish I could fix what's happening instead of just medicating my patients so they don't mind what's happening. You know, that's insane.
You know, there's another part, I think, of what we're talking about, which I think, you know, you've alluded to. And I have learned some of this from one of my friend colleagues named Dr. Jack Saul. He's a psychologist who wrote a book called Collective Trauma, Collective Healing.
Nice.
And he's done a lot of work in, you know, severe traumatized circumstances, such as, you know, the aftermath of 9/11, you know, the war in the former Yugoslavia, et cetera. And he's come up with one of the ideas he's come up with, which I think is relevant to all of us today in this conversation, is that it's not just about doing individual work to work on our trauma and processing the trauma, but he suggests that we need to become involved with a collective. That collective action is what helps to kind of heal collective trauma. And collective action around creating a positive vision for the future, as an antidote to kind of the negative vision that we're being confronted with. And so once again, we're back to connection at a larger level with a group.
You know, after the George Floyd murders, and we all sort of took to the streets and were demonstrating and marching and chanting, I felt better. You know, I felt better that at least we were all sort of coming out and agreeing, this is terrible, this is wrong, we have to do something. You know, it's a real setup for depression, this sort of learned helplessness and powerlessness, you know, that you're being traumatized and, oh, what can I do though? You know, what can one person do? And it was sort of a collective healing for everybody to just, you know, start screaming about how wrong it was.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if there are others in the group that have a comment or a question. I'd love to hear from you.
So Dr. Powers is asking about, you know, this long history of psychedelics, that they've been around throughout human history, but they still sort of have this place where you have to prove that, you know, there's healing that can be done. And I mean, I don't know exactly why. Well, one theory I have on why it is still sort of the, you know, bastard stepchild or whatever, is that people are really afraid of losing control. And it's a very basic fear that people don't want to lose control. And, you know, with the psychedelics, there is often this ego dissolution, and it can be really terrifying. And I think that, you know, people who are a little bit maybe risk averse or not novelty seeking, you know, they like to play it safe. They get very scared by these things that they don't want to lose control over. And, you know, we've talked a lot tonight about how psychedelics are good for like personal healing in the context of psychotherapy, but what we haven't talked about at all, which is really to some degree where these psychedelics came from, where the real history is their use in group settings, their use in ritualized way, as a sacrament, as a church. So I definitely write about this in the community chapter of Good Chemistry, because it's really interesting. You know, there are several sort of syncretic religions that are built around ayahuasca. And, you know, there's the União de Vegetal, and my Brazilian Portuguese pronunciation is terrible. And there is a Santo Daime, which translates to the Holy Give Me, which I love. But these are two different sort of like churches that use ayahuasca, you know, as part of a ritual to bring the community together and to do sort of group healing. And, you know, it's also worth mentioning that way back when, traditionally, it was only the shaman who would alter themselves. The other people wouldn't. But over time, you know, I think that now everybody drinks the ayahuasca, but in certain cultures, it was just the shaman who would drink the ayahuasca to heal somebody. Mm-hmm. But now, you know, we have these group rituals and these ayahuasca circles where everybody drinks. And the thing that I like about ayahuasca circles is that the next morning, people are processing what they learned and you know what they struggled with, and you know they're sharing. And there's something about that group sharing that again is like great social cohesion, and you know you can really support or empathize with somebody who went through a hard night or a bad trip, or they figured out something very shattering about their history. I love that, the group processing that happens.
I'd like to acknowledge Dr. James Powers. He's a Chinese medicine practitioner, a meditation teacher, among many other things. And he's also been someone who has been a holistic health practitioner at the Center for Optimal Living. So he's brought, a wonderful kind of perspective into the work that we do. And I also imagine that in asking that question, James, you've got some thoughts about it. Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering, just one of the things that your question raised in my mind was that it's in Western cultures that these substances have not been accepted. It's not in traditional cultures, Western capitalist, advanced cultures, which are about separation, I think, from the planet and from one another, and the means of productions, et cetera. But those are some thoughts that I've had. I'm wondering if you wanted to add anything to this conversation.
Thanks, Andrew. Nothing in particular. I think that was just an interesting question to pose because the fact that psychedelics have been around for so long, and it's a curiosity for me why it hasn't, for example, seeped into the general culture in Mexico or some of the South American cultures. If it's been proven to be so helpful in terms of opening up psychologically or spiritually, why hasn't it been accepted broadly in those societies? So it's just a curiosity that I thought maybe Dr. Holland could maybe address possibly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts on this while I collect my thoughts on this?
Well, you know, I've thought about something I think that may relate to this, and that is that in order for us to become civilized human beings, we actually need to disconnect from ourselves. And we need to disconnect from the all and everything. I mean, we have to create a separate ego. We have to develop capacities to function in society. So we restrict ourselves, we limit ourselves, you know, in the service of adaptation and learning to be a functioning member of a society, right? You know, I think spiritual evolution and spiritual work is ultimately the work of disentangling or, you know, undoing the work of socialization to develop a capacity to let go of the ego, so to speak. And that's a kind of work that happens, I think, you know, over the course, once one has really established oneself as a functioning member on the planet, you know, for survival. And so, you know, that taking oneself apart, you know, is something that everyone isn't called to do. And I also think it's an ultimately subversive activity because, you know, when psychedelics or spiritual practice ultimately enables us to see past the socially constructed self, or the social constructions that we have all come to believe in as, you know, accepted reality, and we see beyond them, we become potential subversives in questioning, as we said in the 60s and 70s, authority. What gives them the power and not all of us? You know, what gives them the right to dictate and determine what is true? And so I think that can be very frightening if you're not in a cultural context that supports that kind of development, that kind of liberation. So those are some thoughts that I have about that. Curious if anyone in the group.
Yeah, I would say a couple quick things, but I'm definitely open to what other people are saying. But, you know, I remember the Pema Chodron talking, and she's a Buddhist nun, and she was saying that there are certain cultures, you know, here in the West, like here in the United States, there's a certain sort of subset of people who are very self-involved and, you know, sort of self-absorbed and, you know, trying to fix themselves. And not every culture really has that, you know. And again, I would remind people that the earliest indigenous use of these psychedelics was that the shaman would take the psychedelic, and the person who needed the healing, and it was almost always like physical healing, would just be present with the shaman while they took it. So we don't necessarily have a lot of sort of a framework for a lot of people taking psychedelics today together, which is something I think that's happening now in our culture, in sort of in the underground community. But the other thing I think it's worth mentioning, and you know, people are talking about this quite a bit in the psychedelic community now, is that there's a particular demographic that you know, the people who are using psychedelics for self-exploration tend to be you know, in a different sort of socioeconomic demographic than a lot of other people. And, you know, one of the things that we are trying to focus on is how do we get these medicines that can help people process trauma, how do we get them into the hands of the people who've really been traumatized the most? Because that's not necessarily whose hands they're in right now.
Speaking of hands, we've got two hands up. I'm wondering if we can hear from Inez Mejia and then Derek Rosenfeld. Can we unmute?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Andrew. Great to see you, and
Yeah, great to
finally
see you.
get
Yeah.
to meet Julia. My English is not so good, so please forgive me. I've been wondering for a long time now, after my psychedelic experiences, what exactly means this ego dissolution, because I haven't understand exactly what exactly that means. When do you know that your ego has dissolved? You know, my experiences have been very, very deep, and I think I've been healing many things and discovering many things, but that thing that the ego dissolution that is always around on these issues, I haven't had the chance to understand. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could say, you know, from the sort of biological understanding, there's a certain circuitry in the brain that spends a lot of time going around in circles saying, like, how am I doing? Am I okay? How was I doing yesterday? How am I going to do tomorrow? It's very like self-absorbed sort of circuitry in the brain, these pathways. And this is called the default mode network. And if your brain isn't doing anything better, it kind of goes in these patterns of, like, you know, me, myself, and I, and how am I? And it's sort of narcissistic, right? And so when psychedelics quiet down this circuitry, they sort of disrupt the circuitry, they let different parts of the brain communicate. Instead of the usual self-centered circuitry, all the different parts of the brain communicate instead of just that circuitry. And so the experience of the person may be this sort of feeling expansive. Maybe you feel like you don't know where you end and the rest of the world begins. Or there's something called oceanic boundlessness, which is that you feel like you are a drop in an ocean, that there are no boundaries, that you have no boundaries. And this is sometimes very terrifying for people when they sort of lose their sense of self and they feel like their sense of self is sort of disintegrating. Some people, that may cause somebody to have a bad trip. You know, they don't like that sense of losing themselves. Other people find it really, that it's tremendous bliss to expand into something bigger and to become more boundless. It doesn't happen to everybody. It doesn't, even if it's happened to you, it won't necessarily happen every time, even if you take the same amount, you know, the same milligrams or grams of dried mushrooms. You may have an ego disintegration sometimes and not other times. But it's part of like a classical mystical experience that, you know, there is a void and then there is the light. And when you're in the void part, it's like nothing exists and you don't exist. And then when you're in the light part, it's sort of like everything exists and is connected and you are part of everything that's connected. So I'm explaining it very binary, black and white. Not everybody has a void and a blissful melding with the universe every time they take psychedelics.
You know, we might also think about it in kind of psychological, developmental, psychological, and experiential terms. I mean, Julie alluded to some of that, but that, you know, the self, the personality, the me is a structure. We talk about psychic structure, so that personality is structured, it's patterned. I think it's rooted in networks in the brain, but we can think of the sense of self as a structure. And psychoanalysis has different ideas about the structure of the personality. There are different theories, but for whatever reasons, it seems that psychedelics seem to have the ability to loosen the structure so that in lower doses, you know, the defensive structure, that is the structures that keep parts of our awareness from parts of us that we are unaware of, what we might think of as unconscious, become more accessible. And so in lower doses, people seem to have greater access to their histories, to trauma, to suffering that has been kept out of awareness. In higher doses, it's like the structure dissolves. And that's where there's this sense of ego dissolution, of the loss of separation between what's inside and what's outside. And if it seems to me, you're doing this, you know, at a rave or at a party or with some friends. That can be a pretty terrifying thing. But if you're doing this in the context of a healing group, of a ceremonial community, with a shaman or with an elder or with a therapist, who can create safety and kind of be there to support you through the terror, what might feel terrifying, of giving up this self-structure, there's then this oceanic experience of oneness. And what's really fascinating to me is that a lot of the current psychedelic research, which is showing you know, significant improvements in depression and anxiety and clinical syndromes, you know, intractable PTSD, the positive outcomes are highly correlated with a powerful mystical experience.
Right, and that sense of oneness, right.
Which is, you know, it's just an incredible sort of empirical support for the mystical experience as being a healing experience, which, you know, traditional religion and spirituality has always known. Eric, you had a comment or a question.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well being here with you all. This has been a really, really great discussion. So I want to say thank you. First I want to just say, I put a link. Andrew, it felt like you were reading straight from an op-ed I wrote when you were, I just want to amplify your, we are all drug users comment. It was very powerful. And so I just want to echo that.
Yeah, and how would you amplify that?
Oh, I mean, literally everything you said is, if folks want to just take a look at the link I put in, I mean, it really is, whether you're a coffee user or a marijuana user or, you know, one of the epiphanies I had when it came to that was, you know, growing up, when you went to the pharmacy or whatever, we call it going to the drugstore. And it's just such a normalized way in that sense. And then you look at drugs that are made illegal for various reasons that had nothing to do with the drugs themselves, but based in racism 100 years ago. Meanwhile, these drugs have been around for hundreds or thousands of years. And just the way we made distinctions between illegal and legal, and, you know, what is bad and what is good. And, you know, we are truly all drug users. And Julie, I want to say, like you were talking before about the importance of being with your family or your network, your support network during these tough times. And, you know, I just want to say your Facebook videos with your family are such a bright spot in because my family has been like a rock for me throughout this time. And whether it's your family, whoever it is, it's so important to be with your support network. But, and I'm a musician too, so I just relate to that a lot. Anyways, my question. Thank you. Thank you. My question is about, you know, you started touching on it right before, but I still want to talk about it. It's like the issue of access. You know, psychedelic assisted therapy can be so incredible, but as it becomes legal or normalized, I mean, it's going to be available to so few people.
Right.
And, you know, like most people who overcome addictions do so without like a formal treatment program, like self-recovery.
Right.
You know, microdosing is growing in popularity, and, you know, people are just becoming more aware of the potential with using psychedelics. So my question is about, like, what would you say to people who are either experimenting with microdosing or just want to use psychedelics for, you know, self-growth and stuff like that?
Yeah, and also somebody asked about ketamine, and I feel like I can address sort of all of these things. Like, you know, it's great that we have ketamine because it gives people a chance to do something legally, right? And maybe even your insurance will pay for it. That you can have a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy experience to treat your depression. You're not breaking any rules. This is FDA approved, and maybe your insurance will pay for it. So one of the things that I'm focusing on is how do we get insurance to pay for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy? How do we get insurance to pay for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy? And that means like boring stuff, like, you know, that you have to develop procedural codes, and that you need to have some sort of, you know, certifying body that agrees on, you know, who's going to do this work, and who will be sort of the clinicians. But we're all looking at sort of more access to more people. You know, we need, certainly MAPS has been really trying to focus on recruiting therapists of color, for their studies, and then trying to recruit research subjects who are people of color, or indigenous, or gender fluid, or just anything sort of that's not like a white male, which is traditionally how medical research is done. You know, everybody needs to know that there are lots of studies that they don't even run women, they only run men. And a lot of research is done in like very particular demographics. And it's also the case with the psychedelic research, the MDMA assisted psychotherapy research for PTSD, and the psilocybin assisted psychotherapy research, that we're missing a lot of sort of core segments of a population. So one of the things that we really need to look at is how do we make it more accessible? And I think that one of the ways that we do it is to get insurance to pay for it. And then of course we have to get everybody to have insurance, which is a whole separate conversation. But, you know, God forbid we should just have, speaking of oneness, can you imagine one company, one network? Sometimes I'll lie awake at night and just imagine that, you know, there's no such thing as in network or out of network and insurance, because it lulls me to sleep. But these are like lofty goals. And also I just want to acknowledge that my husband and partner, Jeremy Wolf, is listening in, and he is, you know, my musical partner. Absolutely. We have a band called The Rivals, and we have been posting a song a day on Facebook since quarantine started. And it was really about connecting as a family, you know, that our family was going to come together once a day and play some music and make a recording. And, you know, it was a way to give us a little bit of structure and to give us a sort of a creative outlet and a chore, you know, that we could do together as a family. So I appreciate you acknowledging that, Derek.
It's okay.
I want to make a pitch for another part of this, which is, you know, I believe that we have many good ideas and we have many good practices, including, you know, harm reduction, substance use treatment, psychedelic assisted therapy. We might hear a little bit from Charlie about the book that he's just published about his own love affair with MDMA, and you know, how he wants to bring his personal experience as a model for encouraging other people to explore this very wonderful chemical. But something that's been really at the top of my mind is that there is such a, I mean, I think on the one hand, we're in the middle of a kind of sea change in this culture in the last couple of years, in which maybe it's the opioid overdose epidemic, it's the psychedelic research, it's the breakdown of, you know, our faith in leaders, that many people across this country are becoming shaken out of old, rigid, you know, bad thinking and practices and open to new ideas. And so on the one hand, we're seeing, you know, lots of people interested in harm reduction, in progressive treatment, in compassionate care, in psychedelics. But I still think that we need to organize. We need kind of movements, organized networks of people that can put political pressure to pressure the powers that be to support the implementation, the acceptance of, you know, healthcare to cover these treatments, healthcare to, because they're all cost effective, you know, right. And actually some of the insurance companies are really getting on board. They're realizing that if you provide harm reduction treatment for people before they've completely destroyed their lives, you know, in the long run, it's cost saving for them.
Right.
You know, many times over. And also with the movement to decarcerate people and deflect people from treatment. So, but we need, I think, movements, and we need organization, and we need to come together to, you know, to move society along, to embrace these things.
Yes, I certainly would agree with you, Andrew. And I'm happy to underline the word you used before, subversive, because psychedelics are, in my opinion, inherently subversive. They just are. They subvert the whole. In the 60s, we would trip and find the military-industrial complex completely hysterical, completely absurd. And that was really seductive. And that's one reason they wanted to shut us down, because we were laughing at them. But these experiences it's a democratization of growth and of spiritual awakening. You don't need a priest anymore to tell you to connect you with God. You can take a pill and if it's pure in the right dose and the right set and setting, and experience God. It's the democratization of it. Anyone can do this. Can do this if and that's why it's so important to get to have access available to marginalized communities. But the implications of psychedelic use and the psychedelic renaissance are endless and thrilling to me, and the chief source of hope I have for the world right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Charlie.
Me too.
So I think we're just about at the end of our agreement here to spend this time together. Julie, do you have any final words, sentiments you want to share with the group?
I guess, only that I would really add some cannabis to this conversation, that I think cannabis is subversive, and I think it democratizes medicine. I think that when people can grow their own medicine and they can avoid, you're talking about avoiding the priest and going directly to God. And I would say when you're growing cannabis, you can avoid the pharmacist and the doctor and your insurance company. You're just growing your own medicine. It's very empowering. So these ideas that things are subversive or democratizing or empowering, that means that they're exactly what we need right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this first Optimal Living Dialogue. And I want to thank you, Julie, for joining me and sharing, on so many levels around so many important topics. And it's lovely to have this community to be part of and to exchange with. So I look forward to seeing everyone at our next gathering.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. Thanks for inviting me. This was lovely. Everybody stay well, please.
Yeah, be well, be healthy, stay safe, and
stay in touch.
Stay connected.
Stay connected. That's what I meant to say. Yeah.
Stay connected.